Welcome to Eating Enlightenment. I'm Jared, and today we're talking about anxiety and little story from my friends who were actually introduced to me by another close friend of mine. They deal with anxiety. They de-stigmatize anxiety. Anxiety is the most common mental health struggle that people have. I read when I was taking class back in graduate school for counseling, I read that I think 30% of people have some sort of form of anxiety that is pretty bad, that impacts people's lives. And so we're talking about it today. Austin and Lindsey are on the podcast. We're talking about anxiety. We're talking about what worked for people who have gone through panic attacks before. And they're really sharing their experiences, their strategies and tools. It's interesting to hear that Lindseys has this more like cognitive approach, more like thinking about it. And Austin has sort of a more like, I'll say present moment approach, but they both have different approaches on how to deal with panic attacks, how to deal with anxiety. And now they're at the the Disconnect podcast, which is all about this stuff. So really encourage you to take a listen and then go visit them at their podcast, The Disconnect. And then lastly, if you want a free little report that I've created about food addiction, it turns out food addiction is not real. It's not in the DSM-5. It's not a diagnosable disorder. I know it feels real. Trust me. I've been in a similar space myself. I know food addiction feels so real, so powerful, so like you don't have control. But the bottom line is that it doesn't actually exist. I know that's crazy, but this food report goes into the TED Talk, the science experiment that gives it, that talks about it, that explains it all really simply and clearly. And so that is at eatingenlightenment.com/podcast. It's a special giveaway, free book that's for the podcast subscribers. So that's what you go, eatingenlightenment.com/podcast. Enter your email. You'll get that book. You'll get another great interview with a woman who's beaten food addiction. It's really a resource for you guys out there. So check that out, eatingenlightenment.com/podcast. Without further ado, let's get into today's episode with Austin and Lindsey.
So last summer of 2019, anxiety was something I dealt with like my whole life through college and everything. And so I met Lindsey, 2015, 2016. No, it was 2015 when I started. So we worked together. I had met her and we had grown closer through the years. And I took on a full-time position with where I was working. And so we were like in the same position and everything, and we were working together, getting closer. And then, so last summer 2019, like it was anxiety like I'd never seen before. It was just like panic attacks came out of nowhere. Never really dealt with that in my whole life. Like anxiety, yeah. Now that I think back on it and kind of understand kind of what a panic attack is and feels like, I've had a few of them maybe in my whole life. But oh man, last summer was just, as I'd mentioned with you last week when we were kind of talking, I'd gotten to the point where I'd finished school, I jumped into a job, I jumped into a master's program. I was checking all the boxes to, I guess, the American dream, you could say, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I just, I kept going, right? I was just working, come home, do some stuff, go to bed, wake up, repeat, right? And it finally got to me, it was just, I wasn't taking care of myself. I wasn't doing things that were beneficial to my overall health, right? I wasn't necessarily eating right. I wasn't, really cautious of like routine or sleeping or anything like that. I was just kind of winging it, I was just going with it. And so I really started to see the effects of that. And Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and we could talk about too, like we can talk about what it was like for me, right? And then because Lindsay's had them before too, so we could talk about what it was like for her. But then more specifically, we can also talk about what it was like for her to see me at work and see me going through that, right? We began to get closer and closer as coworkers, and she could really sense that something was off, right? Oh, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm great. It was just like you can tell that there was something going on, right? And something was affecting me. Um, so internally, I just noticed. So the summer months for our job at the university, it kind of starts to pick up with. So we worked at the university in Flagstaff, and the summer months are when um, the incoming freshmen for the new coming class are coming to orientation. We're doing a bunch of stuff over summer, trying to get everything wrapped up from the previous year, while also getting things ready for the fall, right? In the fall, typically about July, August, September are like our busiest months of the entire year, right? So that's kind of work, right? And so I kind of came into the summer, really just I was in some tough classes with my master's program. And so it was taking up a lot of my time outside of work. And then in work, it was just busier. Right. And so I found myself just kind of rolling with the punches. Right. And just not really being conscious of what I'm doing. Right. I'm just trying to do so many different things. And it felt like I just wasn't I couldn't even take a moment to collect my thoughts or gather my focus, right? And I like she, and she'll attest to this, right? I think she started to notice, you know, I was dropping the ball with some things, right? In just terms of my overall quality with phone calls and, emails and interactions, right? It's just like I'm a social butterfly, right? I'll talk to like a bush, right? And I'll go have those conversations, right? But then it started to get to the point where it was just like, I was like freezing up and like internally, my heart was racing constantly in these instances, right? Through these phone calls at work, these stressful situations, whether we're dealing with students on the phone. Yeah, my heart's racing. And then I'm starting to think about it. Okay, what's going on? Like, what could this be? Right. And then it's kind of just this panicky, like anxious and like on edge type feeling, right? In the middle of trying to focus on the person that's in front of me, right? They're coming to see me. I'm trying to help them, right? But like mentally, I'm not there. Like I was compartmentalizing all these areas of my life and just not present, right? And so that's when I started to really notice it internally. Um,
That'll do it.
Oh, geez.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like as you can probably tell, Austin talks a lot, right? And so for we love that. We love that about Austin. It's one of our favorite things, right? It makes the podcast interesting. But with that, like it felt like he was shutting down, and like that's not typical behavior for him. And I'm really in tune, I'm usually really in tune with like the people around me and how they are feeling. Like if somebody is like having a bad day, I can notice it from across the room for whatever reason. That's like my superpower or whatever. And so like I was noticing, like being friends with Austin, I noticed pretty quickly that something wasn't right, but I didn't want to say anything because like I don't know what's going on at home. I don't want to like bring it up. I don't want to make it like a weird thing. But the longer it continued, I started to be like, hey, this is like not something you're just like having a bad week, you bounce back from. It was like day after day after day, and it started to get worse and worse. And so I sat down with him and I was like, hey man, like what's going on? Like, let's talk about it. Like, what can I do to help you through all of that? And so that's kind of when our conversation started, when we started having like the talks about like everything that I've been through and how I handled my anxiety and my stress and stuff like that. So I feel like it was probably like a month.
It was several times a day. Like it was, and this was something I'd never had before, so I didn't really know how to like handle it, right? Like trying to be able to explain everything that was going on in my mind, everything that was like bothering me and all of these stuff, right? Like there was just, school, work, my relationship, right? We just gotten a dog a couple months before that, right? Like all these different areas of my life, I was trying to keep, I guess that homeostasis, right? I'm trying to keep a well balance between all of my lives. So I was like here, I was there, I was here, I was there, in all these areas of my life. And so probably, yeah. So I'd say June into July. July was really when it like hit, and I was like, well, what, you know, and the funny thing is actually in May of last year, like I kind of started to notice before it was like really setting in, I kind of started to notice, hey, like I something feels off or whatever. I'm gonna try and see if I can get an appointment in with the counselors on campus. They have like an employee wellness there, right? And so I had reached out, tried to get an appointment. They're like, oh, it's gonna be about 8 weeks or so for the wait list before you hear back. And at that time, it wasn't too serious, right? But then as I, got into June, into July, it really started to hit. And so
Mhm.
I think it was around that time. I mean, towards the middle to end of June, I mean, Lindsay and I, well, we just started. I don't necessarily think anything shifted. I think it's just as we began to get closer, I started to open up a little bit more about kind of what I was going through with the panic attacks and not really knowing. Um, and so her and I mean, it started with just going and getting some coffee or tea at just one of these local coffee shops in Flagstaff. Um, yeah, and I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, like we'd get off
Mhm.
work, right? And then we just go and chat, for like 2.5
Yeah, like
hours.
hours at a time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just yeah.
Yeah, so my journey with anxiety has been a little bit longer than Austin's. I like throughout high school I was relatively fine. My junior year I was taking like a lot of like AP classes and stuff. That's really the only thing I could really take. That's all my it was a college preparatory school, so it's all I had. So like I was taking all these AP classes. I finally reached like a breaking point like halfway through my junior year, had like a huge mental breakdown. Like kind of fell off that like cliff then, but then I was like fine after that. Like I figured it out, kind of worked through it and everything. And I was fine throughout college for the most part, like normal anxiety stuff, like new situations, stuff like that. That's normal. And then in 2014, my mom passed away. Um, Unexpectedly, it was just like she was there one day and gone the next. And so that really like is what started all of that really for everything. So it's for me it's been like since 2014 I've just kind of been, and everything that happened after that as a result is just like I've been trying to get back to a normal state of existence since then. But that's really when my anxiety started in intensely, I guess, is when she passed away. And so a lot of those like I think it's the loss of control, I guess, is what I started seeing in Austin is, and that's like, that was like a huge thing for me, is like, that's like, you can't control that. Like, here one day, gone the next. You have no control over that whatsoever. And so that's kind of what I started seeing with Austin, is that it really felt like he was like, it felt like he was falling down a cliff, and he just kept grasping at like straws to try to hold on to, and trying to like, put his attention here to shift it away from this other thing that's not going so well. And then he'd shift it back to the thing that wasn't going so well. And this other area over here would stop doing so well. So it kind of felt like he was chasing problems around, and losing control of things that way. And that's what I started noticing. I think they do. I think in large part they do. I mean, I obviously I can't speak for what Austin's panic attacks are like, but like, just the feeling of like, I think for a lot of people it is that loss of control, right? Like, you for some reason, like, you've checked out from whatever's happening around you. You kind of mentioned that a little bit ago, where you said like you felt like you weren't engaged with the conversations, you weren't present in that moment. And I think a lot of like that anxiety is you're trying to solve a problem that is not currently in front of you. And so I think a lot of that for people is, that's how anxiety manifests, is like you're trying to solve problems that you're not currently facing. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, disassociation. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, you gotta ground yourself somehow. Yeah, that's how my anxiety manifests. So that's how like, I for some reason, for me, it's like, somebody else is driving my body, is living my life, and I'm just in the back seat, just like hanging out, freaking out. And that's and that's how like a lot of my anxiety feels, is like I'm a third person perspective watching somebody else live my life. Yeah, barely hanging on, like.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like the heart racing, and then like mine was more so like kind of, I mean, for me, I mean, the underlying reason may have been, like cognitive, or because obviously anxiety is in your head, right? And so it's, well, so when I started to feel off, right, my heart would start to race. I'd start to think, in that moment where, let's say, I'm having this conversation with you at work or whatever, right? In my mind, I'm thinking, well, like my heart's racing this. Then I guess it was just kind of, I started to get consumed by fear in those moments, right? When I started to notice something was wrong, it's like I lost all confidence in my abilities at work, right? So I was panicking, right? I was sitting there, like, my heart's racing and stuff, trying to keep up with work. Again, like I said, it was busy, it was crazy, right? And so in those moments, I knew now was a bad time to have whatever it was that I was about to go through, right? And so that in itself, right? It's like, well, what happens right now? My heart's racing or whatever, kind of getting that lightheaded type feeling, right? Like, what happens if I just pass out right now, right? Or, things like that, where it's like the what ifs, consuming myself with these fearful thoughts, right? Like, and I'm in the middle of work, right? Then it's drawing a lot of attention on me, right? Here's what would happen if that were to happen, right? All of these people, and then you start kind of just getting caught up in this idea, and it's and that's that thing, right? You said earlier, when that happened to you last week, you're like, well, nobody really could notice, right? I think I guess, I mean, personally, I think anxiety in a whole, right? Nobody ever is going to notice what's going on, right? Nobody's in your mind, hearing what you're thinking, seeing what you're thinking, right? And so for me to be going, do you think I'm having a normal conversation right now? right? In that instance where I'm meeting with somebody in person or even on the phone with them because we work at the call center, right? For me to be thinking all these thoughts and everything and trying to maintain that while I'm, dealing with customers and students and such, right? They have no idea what's going on. So that was a whole other side of it, right? Trying to put on a face like everything's okay, right? But in the I'm over here sitting and trying to collect all these thoughts and stuff in my head. And so what I really mean when it's in your head, right? It just, well, what if this happens? It's like the what ifs, these fearful thoughts and such, right? And then with how anxiety is, it does some, wild tricks to your body, right? And I'm sure if you ask Drew about this, right, he can attest to it, right? Those anxious thoughts, the heart palpitations and such like that. Like, right, if you think like, oh well, you know, I'm gonna Google these symptoms really quick. I don't think, I've dealt with anxiety before, I think I'm fine, right? And you Google like, shortness of breath and heart palpitations and lightheaded, right? It's gonna tell you you're
Yeah,
probably in
all of a
cardiac
sudden you're having
arrest.
a heart attack.
Yeah, you're having a stroke, right? And so all of these type things, and I think that the biggest piece, right? And I think this is where her and I agree, and even Drew too, right? That hypochondria type feeling where you're like, oh,
Mhm,
Dr. Google says I'm about to drop dead. I'm having a stroke, right?
mhm,
So it's more so of like that type of stuff all going in my head when my heart was fluttering in this conversation with somebody at work, right? And so all these things, and so your body actually tricks you into thinking. So if you
mhm.
think, oh, like, the symptoms, having some pain in my left arm, right? Or, shortness of breath, right? You'll start to you're like, oh, like actually, I feel that, right? Like, and you're trying to check in the box off of like
Mhm,
all these things, right? And so, um, I mean, the body definitely does play tricks on you
mhm.
that way.
Well, that's the whole thing with like when you're emotionally hijacked, right? There's the whole thing where you're not thinking with like your frontal lobe, you're thinking with your animal brain. There's actually somebody in our office that explains it really well. She calls it flipping your lid. And so basically like this is your animal brain and this is your like frontal lobe, and when you're emotionally hijacked you flip your lid, right? And so now you're just thinking with this part of your brain. And so like this is your animal brain is fight, flight, or freeze. And like that's all that you can think about in that moment is how like everything is going wrong, and you have no logical like nothing to ground you anymore. And so really like what I've found for me is really trying to bring that back and close that lid and try to say like, okay, well, what are the rational reasons why I may be feeling this way? So to Austin's point, like what are the rational reasons why my heart is beating so fast, right? So you had a lot of caffeine. That right there probably is what happened. You were just doing a lot of exercises. That's probably adds to that somehow. But when you're in that heightened emotional state, you're not thinking with any kind of rational thought. You're just thinking like something is chasing me and I'm either going to fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so you have to like bring it back down. Um, mhm, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Mhm. 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 And it's really hard to do. It's something it's I for me it's been part of like mindfulness techniques and learning like to just like when I'm feeling like that to take a step back and to pause, right? Like I'm going to sit here and I'm going to take a second and I'm going to evaluate the situation, right? I'm going to pause and evaluate. And so that's really been for me what's really helped me is like when I'm feeling this way where there's no longer any kind of rational thought, there's some kind of like thing that I've been able to do where something is still in control. One of these is still in control. And so I've been able to like say, okay, I'm going to pause and say, okay, is this rational behavior? Nobody's chasing me. Nothing, I'm not in actual danger, right? So we're going to think rationally about this and close my lid and we're going to find some kind of logic to this situation now. Mhm. Yeah, there are a lot of times where I'm like that, like I don't know why. And there have been times where it's just like I feel like sometimes I have residual feelings from things, like things that maybe I haven't dealt with in the past, or just kind of choosing that inopportune moment to bubble up to the surface. And so, like, I kind of think about, like, is it a certain time of the year? Like, is it around like one of those traumaversaries, as a lot of people call them? And just kind of like really trying to rationalize it, and like whatever you can kind of come up with to rationalize it. It doesn't even have to be the right answer, but just whatever you can do to rationalize it in that moment can really help to bring everything back into focus. At least for me, that's like my personal experience with that.
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, when she's talking about that, right? Like when I was at my worst, like my amygdala was hijacked, right? My lid was flipped, you know, in those moments, I was freezing, right? I was freezing, and then in those
Mhm.
moments when I noticed it, I was like, "Oh, well, I gotta leave," and I started this idea of like escaping the situation, right? Escaping whatever it was, where I was, so I can go try and feel better, right? Whether that's going to the bathroom, getting a sip of water, getting up and walking away, or things like that, right? And then I was like, okay, well, that's not working, right? And I was trying all these things, I was trying to be mindful, trying to really like I never really did much of meditation and such. And so when Lindsay and I started to meet, she was telling me these things of how she grounds herself and really tries to, you know, stay in the present, right? When I was at that, like when my senses were heightened, it was so hard for me to be able to do that. And when Lindsay's like,
Mhm.
okay, just, sit still, close your eyes, try not to think of anything. It was like the hardest thing for me to do. It's because that idea of like compartmentalizing everything. I got all this stuff going on my brain. Hard for me to turn it off, and then it was just impatience, right? I'm like, okay, all right, it's not working. Like, we got to try something else, right? It's just like
Mhm.
I wasn't giving myself enough time. And, now looking back on it, right? Like I can totally see why I wasn't, right? Like it just, I was so just, yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, exactly, and but I think the biggest reason too, kinda how you guys were talking about, I think my biggest, barrier to that was I was figuring out, "Why is this happening to me?" If I can figure out the why, this is gonna stop, it's gonna cut it out, I won't deal with this anymore. But what I've learned, it doesn't matter if it's a meeting that's causing you stress. It doesn't matter if it's, a relationship issue, financial issue, or whatever it is that may be, traumaversary, like she said, right? It's a matter of, okay, you know, here's how I'm feeling. It's because of this. What can I do to help myself feel better, right? It doesn't matter about the why. What can I do?
Mhm.
And so it brings back that conversation, right, Jared? You drank the caffeine, you did a lot of exercise, you amped up your adrenaline's going, right? So by all means, yeah, your body just said, let's keep going, dude. We're going a mile a minute, right? And so for me, I started noticing things, right? Well, okay, caffeine. That didn't, I was pounding a couple cups a day in
Mhm.
college, right? Never really had issues with it, right? But then through all this season of my life, I was like, well, caffeine's a stimulant, and my heart does not need anything to stimulate that thing and keep it pumping faster, right? Like, and so, things like that, taking that away, right? Kind of started noticing, you know, the effects that had on my body in a positive way,
Mhm.
where now when my heart starts to fluctuate, right? It's like, oh, let's get all anxious about this, right? If I'm jacked on caffeine and, like you said, lacking sleep and things like that, right? It's much harder for me to kind of, let's take a deep breath and stop. It's like I physically couldn't stop, right? And
Mhm.
so, okay, well, what can I do to no, not fix that, but what can I do to take care of myself better or possibly avoid that, right? Yeah. So no caffeine, right? Making sure you get the 8 hours of sleep or whatever it is for you, right? Making sure you're getting those, right? That way when the anxiety was creeping back up, right? That way when things started to get like that, you kind of had, you know, you're not you're not running on empty, for lack of a better term, right? You're like, okay, well, let's reassess this, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's for both of us too now, right? Like she would tell me, okay, let's try what I do. Here's what I do, right? Pick 5 things in the room and do this. And I'm like, okay, there's the wall, there's this, I'm typing my key.
So the picking the 5 things in the room is a grounding exercise. So you like it kind of pulls you into the present, right? So if you think like if you're going 100 miles a minute inside your head and you're thinking about things that have happened like in the past or in the future, like all this stuff, you're not thinking about what's presently in front of you. And so picking 5 things in the room is where you ground yourself by looking at, okay, well, I'm going to pick 5 things in this room that I can physically see, and I'm going to try to memorize things about them, right? So like sitting here, I can see Austin's dish with all of his cooking utensils in it. So I'm going to look at that spatula and I'm going to say, okay, that's a brown wooden spatula and it's sitting right in front of an orange spatula. And so I'm really like, it's so dumb. Like saying it out loud is so dumb. But when you're like, it really helps to like focus in on something and it brings you back to the present and you say like, okay, well, this is a tangible object in front of me. It's not the stress of next week. It's not the stress of the past. It's what's happening right here in this physical moment. It's kind of like one of those it's like a you take like an inventory kind of where you do like the inventory of how your body's feeling. So you kind of like you sit there and you kind of start with your feet, like how do my feet feel in my shoes, how do my feet feel in my socks, like how, just kind of it's refocusing your animal brain to focus on something else, because that's what we can do, right? Like I can say like, oh, I know how my thumb feels right now. If I think about it, I can move my awareness to like how my thumb feels. That's like one of the crazy things that your brain can do for some reason. And so that's really what it is. It's just redirecting that energy somewhere else.
And that was the hardest thing for me to do. Lindsay's like, okay, let's, put your feet on the floor. How are your feet feeling? How are your thumb? And I'm like, Lindsay, I don't care how my feet are feeling, right? My heart's racing.
Yeah, it sounds super
I
dumb.
feel like I can't breathe. Like, why am I going to focus on my extremities when I'm trying to just get some oxygen in, right? You got to start, you can't breathe, you're dead, right? And so that's where my mind was, right? Like, so she's trying to do these exercises with me when I was just, my senses were heightened. Dude, it was just, she was like, yeah, you just, you take these thoughts and everything, you picture it as a river just flowing by, right? You have logs in the river, these anxious thoughts, you're just letting them go by.
Oh,
and I'm
I
like,
tried
look,
so many different
you're
things
like,
with him. I was
and I'm
like
sitting here like
thing after thing at him.
and I was like, so how does this work, right? Like I see all these things racing a mile a minute, right? And I mean, I have the attention span of a goldfish, so that didn't help, right? And so I was sitting here, that idea of like, okay, like let me try and imagine this, right? And like, even to this day, right, now that I'm a lot better with those types of things, like it's still kind of hard for me to do, right? But through that, right, I had to start somewhere, right? And so I started with the meditation, right? I started, with some stuff like that where I was just, and I think the biggest piece too, I was putting so much pressure on myself to be like her where she's at with her anxiety. And she's like, yeah, I can just sit down, I can calm my heart rate and this, that, the other, right? And so when I'm trying to meditate, she's like, okay, let's just take, 30 seconds, right? I'm like, I'm trying, well, I gotta sit still for an hour, right? I gotta, just sit here, right? And I can't even sit still for like 30 seconds, right? And so putting all this pressure on myself, right? But in all actuality, with her, what she was good at showing me, right, is like you gotta start somewhere. Baby steps, let's do 30 seconds today. Let's do 45 seconds tomorrow, right? What seems like 15 seconds is just, half a breath in today's world, right? I mean, that made all the difference for me, right? It's just starting where I was and just improving as much as I could each day, doing what I could do in that day, not worrying about where I should be, where I think I should be, where I think I want to be. Just say, hey, and that's kind of that idea, right? Just focusing on the present, right? I'm not stressing next week. I got a big meeting. I don't know how it's going to go, right? Who cares? That's 7 days from now, right? Like, let's just take some time, right? And just focus on the now. So, well, that's more mindfulness, right? And that was the whole biggest thing too. She was like, okay, well, mindfulness and meditation. I'm like, what's the difference? I thought they're the same, right? And it's just, I learned kind of through therapy, right? Like my therapist kind of had put them like, here's mindfulness, here's meditation, so that you kind of jump back and forth between the two. And so what I started, because I've been a Christian all my life, and so my religion and my relationship, like with my family and just like God and like that's been something that's like always been like my grounding and that. So I found there's a meditation app that it's called Abide, and so it's like a Christian based meditation where it's almost like a prayer, right? And so I spent a lot of more time, a lot of time with those types of prayers, and um, so it was like they have like 2 minute ones where it's like just kind of you know close your eyes, take a deep breath, and it's kind of like kind of walking you through like a guided prayer, right? As you're, falling down for the night and closing up shop for the day, right? And so more so of those, and so I think my biggest piece with meditation, is like prayer and really spending a lot of time in that. And through that, I've done started journaling and doing that, incorporating that in my morning routine. And so I think that was another biggest piece too, is like I put all this pressure. I'm like, oh, well, Lindsay's meditating like this. So let me try this, right? It's not going to work for me like it works for her, right?
Yeah, that was one of the biggest things that I was trying really hard to kind of teach Austin and show him is like, it doesn't matter where I'm at because it's not your journey is not my journey. My journey is my own and your journey is yours. And wherever you start is where you're going to start. Whether you start today, whether you start tomorrow, that is your beginning. And however long it takes you to get to the end doesn't really matter because we're never really at the end, right? We're not at the end until they put the nails in our coffin, right? And so at least that's like for me, I think like I'm still learning about mindfulness and meditation and figuring out things that worked for me years ago don't work now because I'm not the same person that I was before. And so like trying to tell Austin like, these are the things that work for me. These are the other tools that I know of that have helped other people. You just have to pick one, stick with it for a while. If you're finding that it doesn't work for you, pick something else, pick a different thing. And really like have kindness for yourself and say like I am exactly where I need to be and any forward progress is forward progress, right? Whether you're only able to meditate for 30 seconds a day or you're only able to be mindful for 30 seconds a day, that's 30 seconds that you weren't mindful yesterday, and that's still progress. And so it doesn't have to be, I think a lot of people get lost in the idea that like, oh, I need to meditate for an hour in order for this to be effective, but that's not the case. It takes years to get up to be able to do that. And so we kind of have this idea in our heads a lot of the time, I think, where we want to be at that finish line. We don't care about the in between, like I'm starting here and I want to be here and I don't really care about what happens in the beginning, in the middle. But the middle part is the important part. That's where all like the growth happens. That's where the journey is. And so really kind of trying to show him like, you know, start with 30 seconds a day. A big thing for him was like he was getting anxious coming to work. And I said, make your goal in the morning just getting up and getting dressed for work. Don't think about going to work. Just get up and get dressed for it. If you can make it that far, then just, and if you don't feel like coming into work, then call out. Like you need to take time for yourself, right? And so then the next day you say, okay, well, maybe I called out yesterday. I've gotten up and I've gotten dressed today. Now I'm going to go into work. I don't care what happens for the rest of the day. I don't care what I have to do for the rest of the day. These are the 2 items that I'm going to do today, and that's it. And whatever else I do on top of that is just icing on the cake, right? And so you just kind of build. And so a lot of that was just teaching him like where his own individual building blocks were and how to build on top of that, like building the foundation and then going from there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got more important things to worry about than this brown but could be tan. It's kind of stained, and I'm over here sitting like, okay, squirrel, let's rein it back in, right? Like I was like, Lindsey, you're not understanding what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Fix this heart issue that I've contracted, right? And so yeah.
You're all of a sudden heart defect that you've just
Yeah,
spontaneously spawned overnight.
yeah, I've diagnosed on myself and gave myself. Yeah, I've got.
That's
Lindsey,
right.
look, I have 6 months to live, right? We're gonna just I need you to focus on me right now, right? Like that's exactly what it
Mhm.
was. Yeah, I mean, it was just, like I said, like I've dealt with anxiety all my life, but I've also, been a Christian all my life, and so kind of just taking it down to that level. Like I mean, I similar to like figuring out why this was happening to me. I was like, God, what did I do to deserve this? Like, why did you put this on me? Right? Did I not do something right or whatever? And now I'm being punished, right? And so through all that, I spent a lot of time, you know, kind of working on my relationship with God and, learning about that and learning about myself through that. And, basically just the biggest thing that I'd learned during that time, right, is there's trials, there's things you got to go through, right? So that you're more prepared for something down the road, right? You had to go through some tough patches so that, you know, when, when well, so what I mean, and this is a great pivoting point into where we are today, right? Like through all that, right? Through my time really being intentional with prayer and focusing on that. And, you know, like I kept hearing, like I felt like God was kind of speaking to me and nudging me. And like, he's like, don't worry, your breakthrough's coming, right? Your breakthrough's coming. Your breakthrough's coming. And I'm like, when's that gonna be? Can I get like a timestamp, right? Can I get like a 2 to 4 week range, right? I'm the type of person I'm like, okay, when, right? And so that's part of that impatience type thing, right? But it was like, don't worry, it's coming, right? Don't worry, it's coming. And I'm like, well, if you can make it quick, right? I'm struggling here, right? Got the 6 months to live, right? I need you to, really come in and and so through that, right, I just kept hearing that, right? And I pressed into that, and just kept trusting him, right? And doing these things, the morning routine, I mean, I'll speak to that forever, right? That's just revolutionized my, like with what Lindsey was saying, right? Just focus on the morning, right? When you get up, you get dressed, right? I was really being intentional with just writing it all down, write up what I was worried about, right? Things like that, and getting it all in, through a prayer journal type thing. And then through all that breakthrough, right? Through all this and these 2.5-hour conversations we were having, we finally got to the point where, like, why don't we just start a podcast?
Mm-hmm.
And from there, we were just like, okay, what does that look like, right? And the next day, she was looking up soundboards on Amazon, right? Things like that, where we're just like, why not, right? Let's press into that. See, and so that to me, that was my breakthrough, right? Being able to go through that, right? And then here we come. October 1st of this year will be a year since we launched our first episode. And so we really started pressing into the idea of the podcast probably end of July, August of last year. Right. And so really like, well, this is crappy what I'm going through. Right. I have, kind of like a religious side in terms of how I deal with it. Right. She's got an entirely different way of how she deals with it. How can we meet in the middle? How can we show my experience, her experience, similar symptoms, right? Similar things that we dealt with, but we kind of handle them in two different ways, right? But at the same time, like, let's talk about that, right? Let's turn these 2.5-hour conversations. Why not, record them and help other people?
It's the disconnect. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The whole 9 yards.
We actually just recently got approved on Amazon Music for Amazon Podcast, so that's fun. That's new. But yeah, yeah, you can follow us everywhere. Mm-hmm. 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 At what cost, right?
Well, and so that idea, so the reason we called it, we were like, okay, podcast, what the hell are we going to call it? Right. All these different names and stuff. And so we came up with the disconnect. So, I dealt with anxiety my whole life, right? And she's dealt with it her whole life. My worst, like my breaking point, right, was summer 2019. Hers was through the span of a couple of years. But what we both realized, right, we're like, why? Like, why, like, what happened? Why is this happening to me? What did I do wrong? Me. What did I do? Right. And then this idea of anxiety, it disconnects you from who you truly are. Right. It makes you think that there's something wrong with you and that you're stuck with it forever. But in all actuality, it disconnects you from who you truly are. And it kind of leads you down that path of, oh yeah, you're not good enough, or, don't go here. It's just like that whole idea of getting just batted down by fear. Right. And so we were just like, well, all right, let's call it the disconnect. Right. It just kind of grew from there. Right. We just kept going with that.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Whatever you want to do.
I mean, you always said,
honestly,
say the plug. So
yeah, the biggest, the best way to find us is Googling Frank Disconnect podcast. That'll pull up your iTunes, your Google Play, your YouTube, our website, right? We have across all these different platforms a way to listen for it, right? We just finished up season 1. So it's about, 17 episodes there. Right now we're kind of, brainstorming and planning and doing a bunch of cool things to get set up and ready for season 2. To get that going, now that we've, like we said, October 1st is going to be a year. Okay. So what, where are we at now? What, kind of doing some planning there. Right. So definitely, I'd say the main point, right? Visit our website. It has all the links to every single, Spotify, YouTube, you name it, right? It's all there. So frankdisconnect.com. That's going to be the best way
all
to contact.
All of our social media handles are Frank Disconnect. So you can find us at Frank Disconnect, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff.